Monster Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We're still trekking through the Borg appearances on the groundbreaking Star Trek The Next Generation series. We now move on to the big one. As I mentioned last week, Star Trek The Next Generation had a very rough start. The series struggled with behind the scenes, issues between the cast members and crew, as well as consistently landing with audiences. But as the series moved into season 3, things were about to change. Season 3 would prove to be the inflection point for the fledgling series that seemed to have moments, but couldn't quite nail it all the way down on a week-in, week-out basis. Sure, the first 2 seasons had moments and episodes that were well regarded to this day. But the characters had the groundwork to be special, but it took a long time for them to settle into what we know them as today. But with the series on the razor's edge of survival, a new approach was taken, with Rick Berman starting to take more direct control over the series, with Gene Roddenberry's health starting to decline. New writers Michael Piller and Ronald D. Moore would be brought onto the staff. Piller, once taking an executive producer role, would issue an edict: every episode must be about character growth. This gave the characters much meatier roles to play and scripts to devote themselves to. Gates McFadden, the actress who played Beverly Crusher, was replaced in season 2 by a different character after a falling out with the production staff, but that was patched over so she could return. The scripts got smarter, the stories were more interesting, and the actors were finally allowed to evolve their characters and grow them into much better, far more dimensional, real-life characters. People that you could actually feel like you know how they would react to certain scenarios. And all of this would lead to this story, The Best of Both Worlds, a title that seemed confusing at first when part 1 aired on June 18th, 1990, to scores of fans that would go through the summer of 1990 completely and totally teetering on the cliffhanger and barely able to wait for the September continuation. We'll definitely be talking more about that in a bit. So let's get into the terrifying return of the Borg in The Best of Both Worlds. The Enterprise arrives at a planet with one of the Federation's outermost colonies, who sent out a distress signal, but it's gone silent for the past 12 hours. When Riker, Geordi, Data, and Worf beam down to what they were told was the center of town, it's revealed the town isn't just gone, but entirely scooped out of the ground. Much like the planets along the neutral zone that were attacked recently, and just like the planet the Enterprise probed when they were 7,000 light years away from home in Q-Who. So from Starfleet Tactical, we meet Admiral Hansen and Lieutenant Commander Shelby. Hansen says they're just not ready. If this is the Borg, they're not there yet. Shelby is there to make sure if it is indeed the Borg, and if it is the Borg, they seem to have arrived a little earlier than anybody expected. Shelby says they have new weapons designed, but they're still on the drawing board. Hansen is pretty high on Shelby's ability and thinks Picard should claim her as a new first officer because, once again, Riker's been offered the command of a starship, but he's been really reluctant to accept any promotions. When exploring the site of the attack, Shelby rubs Riker the wrong way by arriving at the site earlier than Riker's orders and basically superseding them. Still, her report proves the Borg attacked the area and are now within Federation space. And with them in Federation space, they are starting to disrupt freighters and other goings-on. It's then the Enterprise encounters a Borg cube. Now, they don't know if it's the same cube they encountered in the previous episode that the Borg were in, but they do know it is a cube with the exact same dimensions. Interestingly, though, the Borg hail the Enterprise but want to speak to Captain Picard directly. They order the Enterprise to lower shields and for Picard to transport himself to their cube. Shelby is surprised to hear the Borg is interested in someone and not the technology that the ship possesses. And the cube locks onto the Enterprise and begins cutting into it with their laser cutter weapon. Shelby comes up with the plan for Data to fire phasers at random frequencies that the Borg can't catch up to. This frees them and allows the Enterprise to escape into a nearby nebula to hide from the cube. And sure enough, it works. The cube can't break through the makeup of the nebula to find the Enterprise. They review the attack and come up with a couple of plans. One is to use the deflector dish to channel a whole bunch of power through it to essentially create a super weapon. The second is Shelby's plan to separate the saucer section from the secondary hull to attack the Borg cube with essentially what would be two ships. Now, Riker doesn't like that plan, thinking it's a little bit too iffy and a little bit too dangerous to risk, but Shelby tells Picard anyway, leading to more friction between Shelby and Riker, and her basically telling him that if he's unable to make necessary risks and to, jump at those opportunities when they present themselves, that he needs to get out of the way of the people who are willing to take those risks. Picard tours the ship as they wait for their next move, and he stops off in 10 forward to have a heart-to-heart with Guinan, and she offers some assurance that no matter what anybody thinks right now, humanity will find a way to survive this. They always do. But the conversation is cut short by essentially an ion storm of some sort within the nebula, and this forces the Enterprise to warp out of the nebula with the Borg ship in hot pursuit. And when the Borg cube drops the Enterprise out of warp, the Borg begin to beam onto the Enterprise bridge. One Borg beams right next to Picard and kidnaps him before the cube then warps away, now with the Enterprise in pursuit. Worf figures out that the course the cube and the trailing Enterprise is on is a direct path for Earth. The Borg lead Picard through the ship, where he's told his biological distinctiveness will be added to theirs, and the human race will be assimilated into the Borg collective. And in order to prepare the species for that assimilation, it's been decided a human voice will be given the authority that humanity bases itself on to speak for the Borg, and Picard will be that voice. Meanwhile, on the Enterprise, Troy reminds Riker that his place is on the bridge of the Enterprise as its de facto captain. So Shelby, Worf, Dr. Crusher, and Data are ordered to beam over to the Borg cube to retrieve Captain Picard. When they get on the cube, they are basically ignored, as to be expected. There's also kind of spotty tricorder readings, so it's hard to pick up any actual readings of human life to be able to locate Picard. As they continue through the cube, they discover Picard's communicator badge and his uniform. With time running short to drop the Borg cube out of warp and both ships rushing headlong into the very heart of the Federation, the away team opts to destroy some internal workings of the Borg cube to force the collective to start working on that instead of keeping the ship at warp. This works, but as they start waking up some of the drones who begin to swarm like bees to deal with this disturbance, it is soon revealed what has happened to Picard. Now, I need to recontextualize something here. I was 13 years old when the first part of this episode, the final episode of season 3 of Star Trek Next Generation, aired. And I was a massive nerd. I had watched every episode that came before this one. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was watching the series grow and get better over that time as well. And I remember seeing Q-Who and thinking, whoa, those Borg dudes are pretty bad business. So when the promos were running for this episode, it promised the return of the Borg and an escalation of what we saw the previous season. It just was a promise of an exciting season finale. There was zero indication at the time what we were about to see. I had no idea the depths of the Borg's master plan. So the final 5 minutes of this first part of The Best of Both Worlds were utterly shocking and nothing I had ever seen before in Star Trek. So, as the Borg begin to swarm with the damage being caused by the away team, soon we see Captain Picard. Dr. Crusher, the woman who Picard had, shared some hints of a potential romance with, and someone he's known for years, calls out to him by casual first name, Jean-Luc. When he turns to face them, he's got Borg shit all over him. He's been turned into a Borg. The away team returns to the ship, and Picard, now designated Locutus of Borg, hails the ship. And Locutus tells the Enterprise that life as they know it is now over, and from this point forward, they will service the Borg. Riker gives Worf the order to fire their big new deflector disc super weapon as the screen goes black and the words "to be continued" appear on screen. And so the conclusion begins with that deflector dish weapon discharging with zero effect to the Borg cube. Because Picard was aware of the plan, the Borg was aware of the plan. And because the weapon basically shut down the Enterprise, the Borg cube continues on toward Earth without pursuit possible. Meanwhile, Starfleet has mobilized 40 ships to intercept the Borg at Wolf 359, and the Klingons apparently are sending ships too. By the way, a couple of things about that. First of all, Wolf 359 is a real red dwarf star in the constellation of Leo, so that's kind of neat. Real world location. Second, I guess I can figure out what ended up happening to the Klingons if they ever did arrive at Wolf 359 and if they were part of the wreckage that we'll see later. But I don't know. I forgot that they mentioned that they were going to be part of that. So I'll have to look up and find out whatever happened to that. But anyway, Admiral Hansen says he doesn't believe Picard would assist the Borg in any way, shape, or form, but also recognizes that he is basically the first casualty of this war. He's basically labeling Picard as dead at this point. And he states that either the Borg will survive the battle at Wolf 359 or Starfleet's Armada will. And he then promotes Riker to captain, and Riker goes about the business of how to try to figure out how to fight back. And Worf reminds him that the Borg have neither honor nor courage, so that could be an advantage that they have. And Riker then opts to promote Shelby to his first officer. The fight at Wolf 359 does not go well, and by the time the Enterprise arrives on the scene, 39 ships are in pieces, with about 11,000 officers and crewmen dead. Riker decides to go with Shelby's secondary plan of attack with the separation of the saucer section of the Enterprise, despite knowing and even counting on the fact that Picard was briefed on the plan. He basically uses it as a misdirect to sneak Data and Worf in a shuttlecraft through the Borg's defense field to beam aboard the cube and kidnap Locutus back from the Borg while the cube carries on towards Earth. Now, while on board the Enterprise, Dr. Crusher discovers that the Borg implants are basically rewriting Picard's DNA on a cellular level. However, they don't really have time for her to do any more study of the effects of the assimilation on the nervous system level. But they try to figure out how to separate Picard from the collective, because severing the connection might be fatal. We've seen when Borg are incapacitated or basically shot dead, other drones come, other members of the collective come and collect pieces off of that drone, essentially severing it from the collective. And once they do that, the drone that's been shot dead basically self-destructs. But they kind of figure out that maybe Data can potentially interface with the Borg bits of Picard to attempt to send a command to the Borg collective to stop the attack on Earth. And as the Borg cube gets closer and closer to Earth, Data continues to poke around inside Picard's connection to the Borg. And Locutus wakes up at one point and nearly escapes as he begins to try to figure out that Data is messing around with the interface with the Borg. But Data stops Locutus's attempts to escape and even rips off his arm prosthetic. That's when Picard's consciousness starts to break through and suggests that maybe sleep is an option. And they figure out that he's telling Data to implant the command to put the hive to sleep. And the command works, and the cube breaks off its attack on the Enterprise just at the doorstep of Earth. After confirming the Borg are indeed asleep, it's discovered that the Borg recognized a malfunction and all their power systems are starting to loop back onto itself, which causes the cube to explode, freeing Picard from the collective. Dr. Crusher removes the implants and Picard's DNA begins to repair itself, but he is left with all of the memories of what happened. So let's talk about the three things I like about the best of both worlds. First, much like with last week's episode where I talked about Q-Who, there are little things that are sprinkled throughout this episode that give so much more depth than you think it might. At the officer's poker game, for example, and I love this scene, Riker tries to bluff his way to a victory only to be defeated by Shelby's desire to see the play through. If she loses to something that would have taken, an even better, more monumental hand than what was likely possible. And it basically shows that she fought to the end regardless of the opponent being potentially unbeatable. Riker was being wily and trying to seek victory by unconventional means. Interestingly, we also see Wesley Crusher losing by overthinking and folding the superior hand out of fear. That plays into something that we see later from him. When it does seem like the Data is not going to have enough time to break through to the Borg subroutines and tell the collective to go to sleep, Riker orders Wesley to set a course that will basically ram the Enterprise into the Borg cube. And Wesley is quite scared of that concept. So we see that play out later. Data's commentary about Riker possibly bluffing is showing his analytical side. Geordi admonishing Wesley for folding 3 jacks shows he explores options before tossing his hands up and giving up. And then there's Troy just watching and seeing the behavior at the table. Remember what I said about the edict being passed down that every episode had to have the goal of building character? This is what I was talking about. This is a scene. It's a poker game in an episode that will prove later to be one of the most important episodes of Star Trek ever. But it isn't there to fill time in a 2-part story. It's not there to be an action scene. It's there to give you a bunch of insight on how these characters' personalities, the way they think things through, and how they will handle scenarios will be seen later as this whole story plays out. It's brilliant. I'd wonder if many intellectual properties like Star Trek, Star Wars, or Marvel type stuff would be willing to go this route in an episode of TV to inform character traits, or if it would sacrifice that for action or just getting to the gist of the plot as fast as possible. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, this episode is almost 35 years old. It's obviously a different time. But whenever it was done, it's still good writing nonetheless. It takes a lot of insight and a lot of potential guts to spend 5 or 6 minutes in a scene that isn't action. It isn't moving the plot forward, but it's informing those characters. That is, like I said, great writing. Second, there is a wonderful scene, another great scene of writing, in the second part of the story. maybe the best scene of that second part. Probably far and away, it's the best scene of the second part, in which Guinan comes to the newly promoted Captain Riker to offer sage advice. She tells him that she hears things down in 10 Forward. She hears that everyone likes Riker, but no one has any faith that he can save them. They all expect to die fighting the Borg. And Riker doesn't think that anyone can save them. He kind of agrees. He's not sure if he's got the right plans. She then explains that there is a pathway to winning this, and that's by letting Picard go. He tries to tell her that, hey, the other day, I just tried to kill Picard with that new super weapon we designed, but she says that wasn't what was going on there. He was trying to kill something that looked like Picard. She says that it would have been so much easier if he had just simply died. Instead, he was taken from the crew one piece at a time, and he lives, but he's not Picard. That's what has basically haunted Riker and the other officers. If he had died, they wouldn't have to look at him when they fire their phasers at the Borg ship. I mean, despite how hard it might be, she tells Riker she's let him go, and she suggests that maybe he should too. In fact, he almost has to. It's the only way to fight the Borg free of that specter of Picard. If the Borg knows everything that Picard knew, it's time to rewrite the book on how the Enterprise operates. It's now got to be Riker's book. She also says something that in that scene that has been a mystery for basically 35 years. She asks Riker if Picard ever told him what their relationship was. And she says it's beyond friendship and beyond family. That line has stuck with a lot of Star Trek fans ever since Whoopi Goldberg uttered it. What does that mean? It's not a romantic relationship. None of their interactions were romantic. So what does it mean that they had a relationship beyond friendship and family? To be totally honest, I love thinking about these two weary old souls having a deep connection with one another and a more fulfilling relationship than any other that either have on board the Enterprise. But I really do not want to know the answer to the mystery. It's just a great scene with a great line about how she was willing to give up something so close to her now that it's no longer the person she knew and loved. Just another piece of great writing. Third, this is said all the time, but it bears repeating. The cliffhanger of Captain Picard being assimilated into the Borg Collective is basically the most iconic moment in the entire history of Star Trek. Earlier, I set the context of what the final 5 minutes of that first part of the episode did to me as a 13-year-old watching it on June 18th, 1990. The surprise ending was completely unexpected. Remember, there was no internet back then. To have even guessed that that could have happened or to have had that spoiled would have kind of required you knowing someone who was there when they made the episode. And trust me, in Indiana, when I was 13 years old, that was not possible. Season 4 and the conclusion to The Best of Both Worlds did not air until September 24th, 1990. That was 3 months and 1 week we had to wait. That was 14 weeks of your friends sitting around trying to figure out if the future of Star Trek was to now accept Riker as Captain Riker and the man once known as Jean-Luc Picard as either being dead or potentially the primary villain of the entire series or, whatever. What was going to happen? How would they resolve this? Was Picard even salvageable? A 13-year-old's imagination went wild with speculation. There have been a lot of great moments in TV in my lifetime. There have been many times I've watched something on TV and tried to figure out what would happen next or what the next episode would bring. Nothing was even in the same ballpark as the cliffhanger of The Best of Both Worlds. The sad thing is that in the day and age of streaming and binge watching shows, I don't think there will ever be another moment like this for me. Even if you do have a cliffhanger at the end of a season or a streaming series, there's no guarantee that you get the next chapter anytime soon, let alone if there will actually be another season. It's kind of sad in some ways because these types of big moments invest people far more, at least in my opinion, than cinematic rounds of extremely long movies cut into chapters on the current platforms. I mean, we had to wait and it drove us nuts. And I loved every agonizing moment and all the jitters I had when the conclusion finally aired. And to even think about it one step further, being a grown-up, I think about, like, if I had seen that at the age that I am now, I would have thought it's like, okay, well, Picard is saved now, or if he is able to be saved, he just killed a whole bunch of people, or he's going to kill a bunch of people. And while they do explore that in the series down the line, and especially right after the second part of this, of the story, the second episode of the fourth season, where he goes home and meets up with his brother, and he has to deal with the healing now of what he was forced to do and what was stripped from him. But still, I mean, none of these things feel present anymore in TV because TV is not quite as episodic as it used to be. And I kind of miss that. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And you can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next up, we go a little more philosophical as the Enterprise crew find a stray Borg and try to figure out how to best use it against the collective in the surprisingly touching 5th season episode, I, Borg. Until next week, stay spooky.